As a designer in the sports industry, the question I get asked the most is, how do you do a jersey swap? Well, before we can answer that, we have to know exactly what a jersey swap is. A jersey swap, or jersey swapping, is really just describing the process of editing a photo to make it look like an athlete is wearing a uniform of a team that they weren't originally wearing. Teams usually do this for things like social media graphics when a team acquires a player through trade or the draft or something like that, and it's a useful skill to have, especially if you're considering going into sports design. You know, after doing so many of these jersey swaps, there's really three things that I think you have to know before you can get started. You have to know Photoshop, you have to know lighting, and you have to have some sort of knowledge of the equipment of the sport that you're editing. So if you're comfortable with that, then let's get started. So I'm going to head to Google and I'm going to look up Deshaun Watson, the Clemson quarterback projected to go high in this year's draft. I'm going to go to Images and I'm going to select Tools and I'm going to change size to 4 megapixel, larger than 4 megapixel. This is going to sort out our images to the largest images available to us, giving us higher quality images to work off of. So I like this photo here of Deshaun Watson, so I'm going to click and drag and drop that into a new file in Photoshop. So now this is placed in Photoshop, and this is the photo that we're going to be working off of today. Next, we got to look for some resource images to swap him into a new uniform. I've decided I want him to go to the New York Jets, so I'm going to look up Jets quarterback Bryce Petty and see if there's anything good that I can work off of there. What we're looking for here is an image of Bryce Petty in a similar position that Deshaun is, so we don't want something drastically different, and we also don't want the lighting to be drastically different. The lighting in that Deshaun Watson photo was a nighttime game, a primetime game, so what we don't want is a really sunny day out where the jersey's going to look like it's being affected by a lot of light. So let's see, this one right here, that one's not bad. It's got a lot of the uniform that we probably won't need. This one's a little closer to the pose that we're working off with Deshaun, so I'm going to go with this one, I believe. We can drag that into Photoshop. So what I'm going to start doing is cutting out the top half of his uniform that we see above the arms. We're going to take that part of the uniform and start manipulating it onto Deshaun. So I like to find a spot on the uniform that is not a curve, like the part of his neck, and start working off of there using the pen tool. Now when you're cutting this part out, you don't have to be precise at all. This is something that we're going to end up losing the edges on anyway when we put it onto Deshaun's body. So don't spend a lot of time trying to get this thing cut out to perfection. Just get what you need and we'll move on from there. I'm going to fast forward a little bit through this selection so that way we don't have to sit through that, and I think I'm going to do that plenty of times during this video, that way we can save some time. So I'm going to go ahead and make that path into a selection, and I'm going to copy and paste this into the photo of Deshaun that we're working off of. The next thing that we have to do from there is start warping it onto his body. The way that I usually do that is a kind of combination of a few tools. The tools that I've noticed work best for me are Distort and Warp. I use Distort to kind of put things in perspective a little bit, to kind of, if there's a part of the body that's further away than another part of the body, like his shoulder is further back, so I'll kind of twist it around in the perspective that I need it. And then use Warp as more like a precision tool that I use to kind of almost like massage the uniform onto him as best as I can. Now this doesn't have to be perfect, but what we're trying to do is line up some of the key elements of the uniform. As you see, I want the NFL shield to be placed right on the collar of the uniform and try to line it up to the uniform as best as we can. So once we get that to a spot that we like, I'm going to go back in with the pen tool and start making a selection of Deshaun's portion of the top of the uniform. A key thing to remember when you're doing this is to try to keep your selection maybe a pixel or two larger than it needs to be. Come off of that jersey just a little bit, because that way you will leave yourself a little room for error where you won't have some excess jersey hanging out the edge of your new jersey. So I'm going to make that selection and I'm going to go back to the original Jets jersey that we're working off of, and once I have that selected and on that layer, I'm going to create a layer mask, and now that removes the excess of the uniform that's not going to be on him. So once we kind of have this basic shell of the Jets uniform on the top of him, I'm going to go back in and start editing some of the more precise areas, like the little pieces in between his helmet that maybe I missed, and make sure that I didn't miss any details within that. So the next step is to start painting in some of the sections where the jersey doesn't cover. The best way I found to be able to do that is the clone stamp tool. I just start selecting around the existing uniform and copying some of those sections and painting them in, for lack of a better term, where we couldn't cover them up with just the photo. So I'm going to start doing that in some of the sections like around his arm, and at the same time I'm going to start covering up that original uniform number. The Jets currently don't have anyone on their roster with the number 9 or with the number 4, so I'm going to try to give Deshaun his college number. So I don't need that 9 still on there, so I'm going to cover that up as well and get as much of the uniform covered as I can. That'll make my job a lot easier down the road. Alright, so the next step that we're going to work on is the bottom of the uniform. I'm going to go back to my image of Bryce Petty, and the first thing I want to do is get the remaining number off of his existing uniform. Something to kind of keep in mind with these Nike uniforms is the template that they use. They have this sort of mesh texture down towards the bottom of the stomach that I like to try to preserve, and then above that just using that sort of smooth texture that they have. And that helps keep your uniform look as authentic as possible when you keep some of those textures in there. So I'm going to go around and I'm going to select that portion of the uniform. I'm going to make a selection off of that path, and I'm going to hit OK and copy and paste that into the Deshaun Watson photo that we're working off of. In the same way we did with the top portion of the uniform, we're going to start warping that into the photo as best as we can. We're going to get as much coverage as possible. It's definitely better to spill over the edges than to not quite catch an area, because you can always chop off a section that you don't need, but if you leave an area open, as we did with the top, you have to clone stamp in some sections, which always looks a little bit worse. So the next step here obviously is to make a selection of Deshaun's bottom portion of the uniform. And once we have that done, we're going to go back to our bottom Jets uniform and create a mask. That way we chop off the edges that we don't need. So now we have him in more or less a blank Jets uniform, which is what we're looking for at this point. I'm going to go ahead and make sure I'm naming my layers at this point, just because after a while we're going to end up with a lot of these pieces, and the easier it is to keep track of them, the better. What I'm going to start doing next is removing any pieces of the uniform that I'm not going to need anymore, like that 9 on the shoulder. I'll just be using a combination of Content Aware and the clone stamp tool. I want to get rid of any Clemson Tigers marks that I don't want to show on my final product. I don't want that logo on the shirt. I don't want it on the pants. I don't want that Nike logo from the college football playoff on his pants. And I want to make sure I keep these details, such as the little bumper on the helmet or on the chin strap. I want those gone. So the next step after this, I'm going to start making a selection of the orange portion of the pants that he's wearing. The New York Jets wear white pants, so I know I have to desaturate this and lighten it up. So the best way to go about this is just make the selection and go to black and white and create a new black and white adjustment layer. I'm going to go ahead and choose my jersey and jersey bottom, put those in their own folder and name that jersey. Obviously, I'm just trying to keep things as organized as possible at this point. I'm also going to label this my pants black and white layer. And I'm going to place that in a folder titled pants, just keeping everything organized and separate from each other, so that way if we need to go back in and make any edits, we know where everything's at. So on top of that layer, I'm going to create a new adjustment layer. That's going to be a levels adjustment, and I'm going to make it a clipping mask. Now I'm going to start sliding this middle bar over and the far right slider until we get a white that we're happy with. That looks close enough to what I'm looking for. I'm going to just bump that around. Yeah, I think that looks fine. So I'm going to go with that for the white on the pants. What I'm going to be doing next is editing these stripes on the pants. So I'm going to make a selection of these, and these I know need to turn green. So we're going to edit these to be green instead of this Clemson purple. So once I've got that selection made, I'm going to do the same thing I did with the pants, and I'm going to make a black and white layer for the stripe and label that so we're staying organized. I'm going to get the green off of the uniform that I prefer and create a solid color fill above this black and white layer. Then I'm going to make a clipping mask and set the layer mode to soft light. And that by no means is a rule. As you can see, I kind of played around with which layer mode was going to work the best for me. You have to kind of just experiment. Every photo is different, so you got to kind of just figure out what works for you. Next, I'm going to select this 4 off of a Ryan Fitzpatrick jersey that I had prepared. I'm going to place that into my document. I'm going to start using the tools that I've been using to warp this onto the uniform as best I can. Then I'm going to go to Select, Load Selection, and I'm going to load the mask from the top part of the jersey. I'm going to do the same for the bottom jersey, this time going to Select, Load Selection, Bottom Mask, Add to Selection. So now we have both of those sections selected. I'm going to take the number and I'm going to create a new mask using those selections. That way we block out the arm where we don't want the number to show up. I'm going to rename that layer Number. And on top of this layer, I'm going to create a layer of shadows. Where his arm is, it should be kind of casting a shadow over the bottom of the 4 and a little bit on the top. So to do that, I'm going to create a new layer, add it as a clipping mask to only the jersey folder. Take a soft brush, switch my color to black, and I'm going to just start painting in on top of where I want the shadows to be. I'm going to adjust the opacity slightly here and there of both the brush and the layer just to kind of get a realistic effect of a uniform that's kind of fading these shadows in and out underneath the arm. This helps the uniform start to feel like more of a piece of the puzzle instead of just pasted on top. It gives it a little bit more depth and makes it feel more realistic. So the next thing we need to start worrying about is this face mask. Now the face mask is a pain to cut out, but you have to be really meticulous about it or else it'll throw your whole swap off. So very carefully, I'm going to just start going around the outside of the face mask. And then once I've gotten the outside done, I'm going to start selecting the inner portions of the face mask and creating new selections and subtracting them from the larger selection of the outside. And this is what you'll end up with if you do it correctly. So as we have with every other selection we've made, we're going to make a black and white mask via the layer adjustment tools. And we're going to place another color fill on top of this layer and create it as a clipping mask. I'm going to set the layer mode to multiply to darken up that face mask to green. And if we look at what the Jets really use as their face mask, it's actually a little darker than that. So I'm going to duplicate that layer and just lower the opacity a little bit, and that way we start to get that darker green and it stands off a little from the jersey there. After the face mask is complete, the next thing we've got to worry about is the helmet. So we're going to start making these large swoops over the helmet, getting it as precisely as we can around the edge, and select the entire image. That includes the inner portions around where the holes are left by the face mask, but we don't want to select the straps coming off of the chin strap. Those we want to maintain there. So I'm going to just fill this layer with any color so I can see what I've selected here. And once I do that, I'm going to pop over to a pre-made helmet that I've had ready. I've photoshopped off all of the face mask of this helmet shell. That way it's a little easier. That's something you'll have to do on your own time, is take these helmet shells and remove the face masks. That way all we're left with is the shell. And as we have with the uniforms, we're going to start warping this on, trying to match up the stripes on it and the holes that we see on the uniform as best as we can. That way it looks as professional and realistic as possible. Something to remember when you're swapping helmets is the different styles of helmets that NFL players wear. I noticed Deshaun was wearing what's called a Revolution Speed helmet, and so I had to find a New York Jets player that was wearing a Revo Speed helmet as well. You don't want to use different helmet shells and swap them onto face masks because it's a dead giveaway of a bad jersey swap. So once I've got this shell kind of placed into where I want to, I'm going to kind of clean it up. I'm going to place it underneath the face mask. I'm going to start messing with the mask a little bit, removing pieces that I don't need and adding in new pieces on portions that maybe I missed prior, and make sure that we get as much of that orange Clemson helmet off of there as possible. That includes some of these little sections that you might not even notice if you weren't looking for them, but they're little side panels and inner panels that are going to show through. We just want to leave as little as possible of this orange on the helmet, so we're going to clean up as much as we have to, and it might take a long time. I have to remind you guys that this did take about 2 hours to complete, so you have to be mindful of the time that you're going to have to put into these things to get them perfect. So I'm going to put in this helmet bumper on the front of his uniform. The Revo Speed bumpers have the team name usually raised up, so I just swap that off of the original helmet and warp that into there, my liking. Maybe mask out some more of this section where I see that the helmet wasn't quite perfect, and over here I noticed I missed a spot as well, so I'm going to clean that up as best I can using the content aware tools and the clone stamp. Next, I'm going to head over to this image of Ryan Fitzpatrick I have and select the number that he wears on the side of his uniform. I need that number 4 for Deshaun, and make sure we only get the 4 off of there. Copy and paste that into our photo and place this on top of the jersey, and as we have with every other element that we're copying into here, we're just going to start distorting and warping it into place. We want to kind of give it the curve of that shoulder, that way it looks a little more realistic, and try to fit it in where that number would be in real life. Just darken it up a shade just because it's a nighttime game, and I'm going to add in just a little bit of shadow here on this shoulder, just make it start feel a little more 3D, and just paint that in as best as I can. Kind of blend it around, mess with the opacity, erase. It's really trial and error with a lot of these things, and I think I'm happy with how that one came out there. So the next thing that I'm going to start working on is something a lot of people forget or neglect to do, and that's to swap out the ball. Now this is really important, especially when you're using a college player. In college they use footballs with these stripes on the side, these big white stripes, and different brands for every school. But the NFL has one football. It doesn't have those stripes on it. It looks the same for every team. So I'm going to take the photo of Bryce Petty. I'm going to get that football off of there, warp it in as best I can, make the selection of the football from Deshaun, and just make a layer mask on top of that. Clean up my selection here, content aware out some of the sections that I may have missed, make sure all the edges are cleaned up. We don't want any of these harsh edges that we have around these fingers here. We want it to look as clean and smooth as possible. So just finishing that up. And once we have that complete, we're really done with the main swap. Now what I'm showing here is something a little extra that I've done. I've selected Deshaun Watson's entire body and made a mask of him and kind of copied the layer beneath him. I'm not really happy with all the orange that we see behind him. I see too much Clemson colors that kind of gives it away as a swap. So I make a layer of the crowd underneath him and content aware the original photo. That way we're left with this weird ghost of Deshaun Watson, but what we have beneath it is just the crowd image. So we have the body, we have the uniform on top, and then we have the crowd in the background. I'm going to create a black and white mask of that, but I'm not going to leave that black and white because I don't want that look either. So instead, I'm going to invert that mask and just start painting in with a brush tool, just a soft brush, some of the sections that I want to be neutralized. I don't want to see that bright orange coming off of there. So just a soft brush to go through and kind of get rid of that orange. And what I'm going to end up doing with this is creating a fill on top of it and clipping masking it in there, giving it that Jets green to make him look like he's maybe playing at MetLife Stadium on a Monday night game or something like that. So once we do that and set the layer mode to, I believe, multiply is the one I end up on, or maybe, no, it's color, and then I use the black and white mask to kind of darken up the crowd there. And the final step that I like to do with any jersey swap is create a black and white layer mask on top of this whole thing and just brush in some sections that may have been affected by having orange light around them. When objects are next to each other, they usually pick up some of the light off of each other and reflect off each other. So as you can see on little portions of his helmet padding and on some of the chin strap, you can see that it's reflecting orange that's no longer there. So what I'm doing here is just making sure that all of those sections are desaturated, and then going around and taking one last look at my edges and making sure we don't have any orange peeking out. This is always a good step to just make sure that you haven't missed anything that you would have otherwise not paid attention to. So you can edit your masks a little bit, start clone stamping in some sections you may have missed, add a little shadow here and there where you may feel like you need it. And once you're done with that, you're pretty much completed with the swap. And once we get that finished up, that's about it. We're pretty much done. I just add a little levels adjustment, just personal preference on lighting to try to make it look a little more dramatic. But other than that, we're pretty much done, so we can take a look at our before and after. Hope you guys enjoyed. I should be making more tutorials and process videos soon, so be sure to like and subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.